Hello, class. I hope everyone is well. There's my cat on the screen there. Go ahead and say hi. It's Miss Roberts here, and tonight we're going to talk about culture and interpersonal communication. Now, although I don't have the entire chapter on these slides, I'm skipping around just a little bit for the purpose of this video, you'll find the entire PowerPoint on your learning management system. Let's begin. So before we talk about intercultural communication, we must first define culture. In the book's definition, culture is language, values, beliefs, traditions, and customs that people share and learn. That's a really neat definition of culture, only because it's so broad. So culture goes beyond just ethnicity or national origin. Culture can also be a part of your hobbies, a part of language, region, and including racial or ethnic or national membership. So it's the language, values, beliefs, and traditions that we share and learn. Now, before you met me or any of your teachers, your parents, your family, and your community were your first teachers. And because of this, those are our origins. They taught us about our own culture. So let's talk about culture a little bit more. They are both bound by perception and definition, meaning that we perceive ourselves as different from others, as the same as others, and we're able to define certain parts of ourselves. We also have in-groups versus out-groups, meaning that we belong and we can perceive and define the ways that we belong in certain groups. And because we can only belong in so many groups, right? We also know there are people outside of our groups or in our out groups or do not meet our definitions of our identity, which is fine. But as regards to culture, we have groups that we belong to and groups that we do not belong to. These perceptions and definition can also make up our social identity. So how we're perceived in the world and how we walk in the world is based on our cultural origins, what we share and what we believe, what we transmit or share with other people can also let them know what we believe in, and we can also learn what they believe in as well. But because culture is made up of so many things, we can also think about co-cultures. So you might have a main culture and subsections of the main culture. So for example, I identify as African American. So not only am I American, but I'm also a descendant of sub-Saharan Africans in America. Next up, we have intercultural communication. So with intercultural communication, we are talking about the importance of culture in the messaging. For example, you would think, especially if you think about the demographics of Southern California, many of us come from all different types of places. Many of us were born in different places. I was born in Detroit, Michigan, and being in the urban Midwest, it's a different type of vibe than in Southern California. But if you think about it, one would believe that just because two people from two different cultures are just interacting with each other is automatically intercultural communication. Now, I could understand how you would assume that. However, that's only part of the story. What makes intercultural communication is not just the social identities or cultural identities of the participants, but the messages that they said. So, for example, if the conversation or the message is intercultural in nature, then that will fall under the intercultural communication category. But if it doesn't, despite the messengers or the speakers being from different cultures, their cultural identity is not enough to classify the communications into intercultural communication. It's the message. For example, one of my favorite foods is Indian food. So say if I go to a restaurant with really authentic Indian food and I ask my friend who might be Indian American, so if my friend's Indian American and we're looking at the menu, I might ask, hey, what region of India is this from? Do you know? What is this spice? How do I pronounce this word? Now, because we are talking about something that's intercultural in nature, we are experiencing intercultural communication. Now, if me and my same friend go to In-N-Out and start talking about the latest episode of our reality show, then even though we still are from two different cultures, that communication in and of itself is not considered intercultural communication unless we talk about different cultural dimensions. So conversations can be from the least intercultural, for example, hey, where is your nearest gas station, through most intercultural. For example, how do I pronounce this sentence in another language? And salience just means what particular weight do we attach intercultural communication to the messaging. So if it has a lot of weight, more intercultural, least amount of weight, least intercultural. Next, and just to go into these terms a little bit earlier, I just talked about them in the first slide. The in-groups are the groups that we identify with. So, for example, and the jury might be out with this designation, but I've been in Southern California for 15 years. I think I've earned the right to say that I'm Southern Californian. Not born and bred, but I spent the majority of my adult life in Southern California, so I can call myself Southern Californian. Possibly. So the in-groups are groups that we identify with, and then we have the out-groups. Groups that we view differently. So, for example, I have a brother who really loves video games. And he has ever since we were little. So I would call him a gamer. And he reads the magazines, he listens to the podcast, he implements some of the strategies that he learned from those mediums. But I'm sort of an outsider in that particular way. I do like some video games, but it hasn't necessarily become part of my identity. I'm not as much of a hardcore gamer as he is. So being part of the gamer culture, it would be considered my out group in that case. So with social identity, it's our self-concept, and we will learn more about self-concept in chapter 3, based on memberships in particular groups. So who are you? In the poster assignment, whether it be online or in person, we will explore what makes us us. If I ask you, who are you? How would you respond? You might say your name. I would. You might say where you're from. You might talk about your major, your hobbies, national identity, racial or cultural identity. All these things make up who you are. But who are you is not a simple question. But no matter how you respond to that question, that's a part of your social identity. So, for example, I'm African American, I'm an instructor, I live in Southern California, but I was born and raised in the Midwest. I lived in Florida for a little while. I like playing The Sims. I like cooking and learning new cuisines. Those are some of the parts of my social identity. Those are the in-groups that I most identify with. And then, like I said before, co-cultures. So think about demographics. So you have age, race, sexual orientation, membership. You have geographical demographics. All those things can be a part of the co-culture, and some of the traditions, lifestyles, and experiences of being a part of that co-culture. So next we're going to dive in to some intercultural communication concepts. Say that 5 times fast. So let's begin with high versus low context culture. So I want you to think about this. Think about how you express yourself. For instance, if you are more direct in communication, where did you learn that from? If you're more indirect in your communication, where did you learn that from? Also think about your culture and how it influences how you speak. So many of us might have roots in other countries as well as America, whether it be immigrated from another country or have parents or grandparents that immigrated from another country. So those communication patterns and experiences also make up who you are. So if you do have those experiences, think about how your relatives from other countries communicate. Are they more direct in their expression, or are they more indirect in their expression? So with those questions, let's dive into low and high context cultures. I'm going to start with high context because I'm going to start with low context because that's a more Western type of communication process, and then we'll contrast that to higher context cultures. So in America and other Western countries, for example, like the UK, Canada, Australia, we value more direct thoughts and feelings. We value clarity, repetition, and very thorough explanation. So we rely more on verbal communication rather than just nonverbal communication. So for example, we want to make sure that we express ourselves freely and clearly and directly as possible. Not to say that in high context cultures they're indirect, however, more direct, and some may argue more blunt communication might be valued in low context cultures. And remember, high and low context is not necessarily either or, but it's to what degree. So for example, in America, we have a tendency to be more lower context than maybe Canada, for example. But more Nordic countries such as Sweden and Denmark, or other European countries such as Germany, have a tendency to be more higher context, more direct than us. So it falls on the spectrum. So now that we know what low context cultures are, let's talk about high context cultures. Now, not to say that in high context cultures that there isn't any verbal dialogue going on, but what you will have to do is dive a little bit deeper. These cultures rely more on nonverbal cues, more prescribed or traditional messaging than low context cultures. Maintaining social harmony is paramount to these cultures. So because of that, we want being blunt or even showing displeasure directly might not be looked as favorably as in low context cultures. So which countries fall under the high context cultures? Many Latin American countries, many Eastern European countries, Asian countries, and African countries fall under the high context cultures in regards to linguistics. So when you have someone from a low context culture and someone from a high context culture meet up, and if you don't have the understanding of these different communication styles, someone from a high context culture might be put off about how blunt or how direct someone from a low context culture might be. Vice versa, someone from a lower context culture might be a little bit more frustrated by the high context culture speaker not necessarily being as direct, or they might not have the patience of reading nonverbal communication or subcontext, or might not even know some of the nuances in communication, and they might impede communication. Next up, we're going to talk about individualism versus collectivism. Now, we like to talk about high and low context cultures and individualism versus collectivism. One of the common veins is which culture values more direct and independent living, and what culture puts a premium on togetherness, being collective, the group. And that, in a way, influences the way that we communicate. So we're going to start with individualistic. So in individualistic cultures, which America falls under, we are responsible for ourselves. We think about and navigate in the world as us representing us. Let me ask you a question. At what age should a child, or maybe an adult child, move from his or her home? Now, when we think about when do we leave the nest, and although there are economic and social and the college life type of factors that go into it, we consider, at least in our society, we consider young adults at 18. Some people might say, hey, leave at 18. Some people say, no, maybe leave at 20. Others might say, hey, leave at 22 when you're done with college. All those milestones, right? But as the adult child grows up in an individualistic culture, there's a bigger pressure for them to move out of their parents' house, to create their own families and create their own lives. So it's easy to say maybe at 18 to 22, maybe even 25 for people to stay in their own homes. But when I'm in a face-to-face class, I challenge my students to think about, hey, is it okay if the adult child stays home at 30? Now I'm always under the assumption that the parents are healthy, they're older, but they're healthy and fine. So we're under that assumption when we ask these questions. So when I say 30, a lot of people are like, no, they should leave at 30. What about 35? What about 40? And as I raise the age a little bit, we get a little bit more uncomfortable. And then, if you got a little bit more comfortable, why is that? Part of that reason why is in American culture is that individualism. We have independent spirit. We value independence. And if you fall outside of what is deemed independent, then there might be a little bit of backlash, a little bit of questioning, and that makes others uncomfortable. So let's think about collectivistic cultures. And I'm under the assumption, if I was in a classroom that was more collectivistic, the responses might have been different. They might have been horrified if I said, hey, let's leave the house at 22. There might be multiple families living together. Even at 30, they might stay to take care of the aging parents. They might have their families and several families living maybe in one household, or at least close enough together so they can pull resources together. So that living arrangement is more linked to collectivistic societies, whereas loyalties and obligations are with the in-group, extended family, community, and or work organization. So with people who come from collectivistic cultures, they walk through the world not necessarily just representing themselves, but representing their communities they come from, their parents, their families. So with that in mind, their decisions might not be as self-purposeful, but they might make decisions based on what is good for my family, what is good for my group. And if you're communicating with someone who's individualistic versus collectivistic, there might be misunderstandings because they might not know where they're coming from. Just like that question, hey, when do you kick out a kid from the house? In collectivistic cultures, it not necessarily is kicking a kid out from the house. In more individualistic cultures, being an individual, making sure you stand on your own 2 feet is valued. Versus in collectivistic cultures, pulling our resources together, traditions, bonds, those are the values that are paramount, and they live their lives in 2 different ways. Next up, we have power distance. Now, what is power distance? It is the degree in which members of society accept an unequal distribution of power. So think about in what instances where power is imbalanced. For example, boss versus employee, parent versus child, even teacher versus student. Okay, so now that we've thought about different power distances in our lives, what does it have to do with culture? Now, in some cultures, there is a low power distance, which means the distinctions between class and status are minimized. Not eliminated, but minimized. For example, think about this. Have you ever had a boss where you had a friendly rapport with? Someone that you maybe went out to lunch with? Someone you might even confide in, even though they were your boss, right? Maybe you had the cool boss, as some might say. If you ever had this type of a boss or had this type of experience, what the boss attempted to do was to minimize that power distance, that even though they are your supervisor, they want to make sure to have a friendly rapport, to have an open type of dialogue with you, and for you to be comfortable coming to them. So if you take that from a micro level to a macro level, for example, in the U.S., even though different organizations are different, the U.S. is leading towards a more lower power distance corporate culture versus back in the day, it would have been more higher power distance. Now, what is higher power distance? You obey authority. There is a distinction between parent and child. Do what I say, no back talk. Teacher, student. Don't ask questions. You just sit there and I just tell you things. Write down the test, make sure you get them right, move right along. Don't worry, that's not what this class is about. Boss and employee. Don't question what I say. I'm the boss. I'm giving you a paycheck. Roll with it. So in some cultures, there are more high power distance. The hierarchy between different people in different positions of power are more set. Or, in those instances, you don't question authority, not to the degree that in low power distance cultures you could. uncertainty avoidance. So this is the degree in which members of a culture feel threatened by ambiguous situations and how much they try to avoid them. So in some cultures, now before I go a little bit further, you have to break down the word. High uncertainty avoidance. It's almost looks like a double negative a little bit. Then low uncertainty avoidance. So always break down the word. That's what helped me remember when I was learning this theory. So in high uncertainty avoidance, people in these cultures need clear rules and regulations. They might have a more structured culture, more structured family life. So when they're in situations where they don't know the rules, it's a little bit more distressing for them. Whereas in low uncertainty avoidance, they're less threatened by the new and unexpected, and their culture taught them how to adapt a little bit more easily to change and to uncertainty. So remember, high uncertainty avoidance means you need clear rules, clear boundaries, and regulations for them to feel comfortable. But low uncertainty avoidance is less threatening, and they're able to adapt and use their tools a little bit more easily because they were able to be prompted by their culture to do so. So I'm going to just talk about race versus ethnicity for a second. And then I also, in the slides, we also talk about gender, sexual orientation, disability, and socioeconomic status in the slides. But I'll just talk about race and ethnicity for this video for a minute. So usually when people talk about ethnicity, they think it's synonymous with race, but it's not necessarily true. So for example, race is a category created to explain differences between peoples whose ancestors originated from different regions of the world, but it doesn't explain individual differences. Ethnicity, if you're talking about intercultural communication, might give you a more deeper picture about the person or the culture, not just based on race. So ethnicity is the degree in which a person identifies with a group on the basis of nationality, culture, or another unifying perspective. So for example, I have a friend whose cultural origins is from Haiti. So she's a first generation American, and both her parents are from Haiti. So although we both identify as Black women and we fall into the same racial category, we have different ethnicities. So for example, she is Haitian American and I'm African American. And although we do have certain similarities, we have different cuisines. My friend's bilingual, so she speaks both English and Haitian Creole. And we have different perspectives because our countries of origins and our ethnicities are different. So you might have the same race, but you can come from different ethnicities. So what are some of the pitfalls to intercultural understanding? Right? What are some of the things that can block us from being competent intercultural communicators? So let's talk about that for a second. Now, as human beings, we have a tendency, or it's a tendency we have to fight, we have a tendency to be biased towards our own experiences and sometimes our own group. So in order to fight this tendency, we must be aware of these three things that can block us from being a competent intercultural communicator. So for example, ethnocentrism is an attitude that one's own culture is superior to others. So you want to make sure that when you're discussing or learning about another culture, you don't want to be like, oh, in America we do this, and in America we do that. And America does it better because they're American. No, you can think about the differences between that culture and what America does, but just because you're American, that doesn't mean everything America does that is better, and vice versa, right? We all have goods and bads of our national experience, for example. Then we have prejudice. So that's a little bit more serious. You don't want to have an intolerant attitude of others. You want to be open-minded. And if you discount people off the bat when you're talking to them or when you're trying to learn about a culture, then it's going to block or impede on you becoming a better intercultural communicator. So if you feel like, oh, well, I had this preconceived notion of this group of people, think about where does that come from? Where did you learn that? And how can we unlearn that? Then there's stereotyping. It's an exaggerated belief and generalization about a group. Think about not only generalizations you might have about certain groups, but what are some of the generalizations about your own groups? Think about how you would feel if someone said or thought about negative stereotypes about you. And then think about challenging your own preconceived notions about other groups. If we can avoid ethnocentrism, prejudice, and stereotyping, we'll be much better off and be much better intercultural communicators. So how do we become competent intercultural communicators? Now in chapter 1 we talked about how to be competent communicators overall. But say if we're in a situation where we are going to another country and we need to learn what they do either for vacation or to live there. Or say if we're meeting someone from a different culture for the first time. Or we are interacting in a more diverse workplace. Or you just want to learn how to talk to others and absorb or learn more about the world around you. Here are some tips in order to become a better intercultural communicator. First, you have to be motivated to be a better intercultural communicator. Sometimes we are in situations where you're like, hey, this is where I come from and I'm going to do it my way. But if you're in another country, you got to do as they do, right? So you have to be motivated to be open-minded and say, hey, I've had this experience, but how do you do things? How do you think? Because I want to learn from you, and maybe you can learn from me. So just being motivated to do it is the first step. Next, we have tolerance for ambiguity. So we talked about a couple of slides back that in some cultures, we might not have the appreciation for uncertain situations, right? So with intercultural communication, because you haven't experienced every culture, some things might be ambiguous. You might be learning the language. You might be learning some of the customs. You might just be in a new place for the first time. And because you don't know, you're stepping in there maybe a little bit hesitant, but if you can tolerate that, get over some of the culture shock, then that's another step to becoming a better intercultural communicator. And beware of some of the things we just talked about. Don't be ethnocentric. Don't just believe because you are who you are, that because someone isn't who you are, they're automatically bad, or your ways are automatically a better way. Beware of prejudice. What are some of your preconceived notions about a group? Learn about that group. Let go of some of those assumptions. So being open-minded to the experiences and the people that you meet is definitely a huge leap to becoming a better intercultural communicator. Next, knowledge and skill. So if you need to learn a little bit of the language before going there to be able to function, do that. There's a lot of apps, there's Rosetta Stone, there are YouTube videos, there are many ways to learn a language. When I think about it, I always wanted to learn Spanish. I started to learn, but then I forgot, so I'm talking about myself too. If I want to do it, there's a lot of tools to help you out. And you can also join language groups, pen pal groups, all those things to help you gain the knowledge that you need to interact interculturally. I only use language as an example. But if you seek the knowledge and the skills for those interactions, you're definitely going a long way as far as getting your intercultural communication skills. Last but not least, patience and perseverance. You're not going to get everything right the first time. You may make mistakes. Definitely apologize for those mistakes and be open about your feelings and be open about what you want to learn and gain from the experience. Think about a cultural exchange. People can learn about you and you can learn about them. And then you're also going to have successes. You're going to learn more words in the language. You're going to experience new things. Experience more perspectives. There's such a big world out there. And it's great to be open-minded and be able to access a lot of those things. And you can even communicate with people from different places without leaving your living room. With social media and other ways of communicating across borders, it's a lot. Speaking to other people from different places and different experiences is a lot more accessible than ever. So be patient, persevere, and follow the rest of these steps. You can become a really good, adequate, better, or great intercultural communicator. Okay, so tonight we talked about intercultural communication, what it was, several theories in intercultural communication, and how to improve our intercultural communication skills. Thank you so much for joining me tonight, and next time we'll talk about communication and the self in Chapter 3. Have a great evening. Bye.